First contact of fear. The prison moon of Kythera drifted in silence around a gas giant whose storms glowed like burning oceans. The moon itself was gray and broken, covered in towers that once hummed with power, now only humming with cold wind and the restless breath of machines. Within those towers, the galaxy had hidden away what it feared most, a creature not born of love or time, but of science and desperation. They called her Karis, the hybrid, the living weapon, a tall girl with pale skin, marked by lines of light and eyes that shifted from gold to blue when her thoughts turned dark. She had once been made to end wars, but when she began to think for herself, the Makers grew afraid. They caged her on Kythera and told the worlds she was dead, yet they kept the cage powered so that no curious heart could ever touch the truth. Elias came to Kythera by accident. He was not a soldier nor a hero, just a technician of a small salvage crew sent to strip old stations and sell scrap. An cruise ship drifted into the wrong orbit during a solar flare, the kind that bends magnetic fields and kills engines. The captain ordered escape pods to launch, but the flare swallowed the signals. Elias fell through smoke and light, his pod crashing into the cold dust of the prison's outer rings. When he crawled out, the air smelled of burnt metal and rain that never fell. He was alive, but alone. The radios hissed with static, and when he called, no one answered. He followed the sound of machines, deeper into the compound, not knowing that he walked toward the one thing every world had chosen to fear. The corridors were long and cracked by time. The lights flickered, and sometimes voices spoke from broken speakers. Voices that repeated the same, warning over and over. Authorized beings, only level 4 containment breach detected. Elias felt his breath shake. He had read about Kythera in Academy records. It was the place where the failed weapon was kept, the monster that tore fleets apart. But when he found the cell, he did not see a monster. He saw a girl sitting in shadow, her knees drawn close. Her hair a tangled river of silver-black wires rising from her back like faint wings. She looked young yet ancient. And when she turned her head, her eyes were tired, not cruel. The glass between them shimmered with energy, but the field was weak from years without maintenance. He should have run, but the silence around her was strange. There was no echo of rage, only a quiet hum, a low tune, almost like singing. Elias realized it was an old lullaby from Earth, the kind mothers used before sleep. He had heard his grandmother hum it in the old days before the sky had been divided by empire. When the girl looked at him, she did not speak, but her lips moved with the same song. He whispered the next line without thinking, and for a second her eyes widened with something that looked like surprise. The sensors above the door flared red, and a mechanical voice shouted, "Intruder detected," yet the power failed before the turret could wake. Elias pressed his hand against the glass, and the girl mirrored him through the shimmering field. He said his name softly, told her he was just lost and needed help, but she only tilted her head and asked with a slow, broken voice, "Are you afraid of me?" He thought of lying but did not. He said yes, but not enough to leave. She stared for a long time, then lowered her head and said in a whisper, "Everyone leaves." That single phrase struck him harder than any scream could have. He saw then that she was not built for war. She was built for fear, and everyone had obeyed. The ground shook. A surge of power raced through the halls as the Warden AI reactivated. It spoke through every speaker like thunder. "Containment priority, initiate purge protocol. All organic units evacuate." Elias froze. He knew purge meant fire gas and vacuum. He ran to the control deck, found the panels fried. He could leave through the emergency hatch, but the girl would burn. He looked at her again, and something inside him hardened. He had always believed that machines follow rules and people follow hearts, and sometimes you have to choose which one keeps you human. He forced open a maintenance hatch, crawled through smoke to the power conduits, and rerouted the system that fed the purge grid. The air filled with heat, but he kept moving. His hands bled from jagged metal, and the alarm screamed until his head rang. He reached the core room and saw that the cell had its own generator separate from the others. He could disable it, free her, but if he failed, the whole moon might collapse. He stared at the red button and thought of the song. In the end, He pressed it. The hum died, and the lights went black. When his eyes adjusted, he saw the glass dim and then dissolve into blue mist. She stepped out slowly like someone waking from a dream. Her bare feet touched the floor, and sparks danced, but she did not attack. She looked at him with wonder and said softly, "I can feel air." He tried to speak, but words failed. She walked closer, her body trembling as if every movement was a question. When she reached him, she stopped and asked again, "Are you afraid now?" Elias said I was, but now I am curious. She smiled just a little, a fragile curve that looked borrowed from some memory not her own. Outside, the storm roared across the gas giant, lightning carving rivers of light across the sky. The prison moaned under pressure. The AI repeated its dying threat. Purge incomplete. Unauthorized contact detected. Elias laughed through exhaustion and said to her, "Looks like we broke their rules." She tilted her head and asked, "Then what are we now?" He looked at her eyes reflecting the storm and answered simply, "Alive." The word hung between them like a promise. The fear that had built her and the fear that had guided him both cracked open, letting something new take shape. In the distance, engines from the salvage crew's lost ship echoed faintly in the clouds. He did not know if rescue would come, but he knew he could not leave her behind. She had been alone too long. He reached out his hand, not through glass, not through fear, but through choice. And she, after a long pause, placed her hand in his. For the first time since her creation, Karis felt warmth that was not from fire, and Elias felt courage that was not from duty. The world outside still feared her, but on that broken moon, one human saw beyond the monster and dared to touch her, the hand. Through the bars, the storm outside the prison moon had begun to fade into long waves of violet lightning across the gas giant's sky, and the light that seeped through the shattered towers looked almost gentle, though there was nothing gentle left inside the ruins. The systems that had once kept the prison alive were dying slowly one after another, and in the silence between alarms, only two voices moved through the echoing halls, one human and one that the universe had once called inhuman. Elias walked with a limp now, his suit torn and his hair covered in dust, while the girl who had been named Karis followed behind him like a shadow, unsure of her own freedom, unsure if the floor beneath her feet was still meant to hold her. He had freed her, yet the air around them still trembled as if the world itself rejected the idea that she could be loose. They found a maintenance deck where the emergency lights still glowed faintly red. The place smelled of old grease and broken circuits. Elias opened a storage locker, searching for rations and water and whatever he could use to keep the systems running long enough to signal help. He found a pack of energy cells and a small flask of liquid nutrient paste, barely enough for one person for one day. He offered it to her, but she only stared at it as if it were some strange object from a dream. He asked if she was hungry, and she said she did not know what hunger meant. He told her it was the ache that came when the body wanted to live, and she smiled faintly and said, "Then I have always been hungry." He did not answer because there was no comfort strong enough for that kind of truth. As hours passed, the moon began to stir again. The Warden AI tried to rebuild itself fragment by fragment. It spoke in broken sentences through the loudspeakers, murmuring words that made no sense, fragments of security codes and warnings about contamination. Elias understood that it was searching for the intruder signature, which now matched both of them. He knew it would not rest until they were either gone or dead. The power grid flickered like a dying heart, and in every flicker he could see her face lit gold, then blue, then shadowed again. She stood near the bars of a secondary containment, Gate 1 that had not lost power yet, and she reached out as if to touch the humming field. He told her not to, and she asked softly why. He said because it would hurt, and she nodded and said, "I was made to hurt. Perhaps it is all I know." Her words hit him harder than the alarms ever could. He walked closer and studied the control pad beside the bars. He knew that if he cut power to this gate, the AI would route energy from other systems and might even ignite the backup reactors. But if he did, nothing, the field would soon collapse on its own anyway and trap them both inside an implosion loop. He knelt and began to rewire circuits the way a surgeon works on a dying heart. His fingers shook from exhaustion, but he kept going. The girl watched him silently, and after a long moment she said softly, "You risk much for me." Why, he told her he did not know. Maybe because she looked more human than all the machines that had built her. She looked away as if the words were too heavy to hold when the last circuit sparked. The bars dimmed to a faint glow. Elias sat back against the wall, breathing hard. He handed her one of his gloves and told her to touch the field slowly. She did, and for a second, blue light danced around her fingers. Then, faded to nothing. She laughed, a sound rough and uncertain but real. He realized it was the first time he had heard her make a sound that was not born from fear or pain. It was small, yet it filled the hollow station with warmth. She looked at her hand, then at him, and said softly, "Your hand is trembling." He said, "So is yours." She nodded and said, "Maybe this is what being alive feels like." Outside the walls, the gas giant's magnetic storm struck again, sending waves through the metal floors. The AI screamed across the speakers. "Purge incomplete, unauthorized empathy detected." Elias laughed tiredly at the absurd words and said to her, "Looks like they programmed it to fear kindness." She tilted her head in confusion and asked, "Can a machine fear?" He said, "Not really, but the people who made it did. They built this place not to hold you, but to hold their own fear in one spot so they could pretend it was gone." She listened to him closely, then whispered, "Then you came to free your own fear too. Maybe you and I are the same." He wanted to deny it, but he could not. They spent the next hours trying to find a way off the moon. Elias repaired old terminals and studied maps of the facility. He found schematics that showed a launch rail deep underground meant for supply ships and escape pods. He told her if they could reach it, they might escape before the AI rebuilt its purge system. She agreed, but reminded him that the rail was locked behind security levels that required genetic clearance of high command. He said he could fake that if he found the right code, and she smiled faintly and said, "Then we will go together." Before they left the maintenance deck, he stopped at the bars where they had first spoken, when she had been still inside her cell. He stood on one side and she on the other, though the field was gone now. He reached out his hand through the empty space, and she hesitated, then placed hers in his again. The warmth between them was steady, this time not fragile, not fleeting. He said softly, "You are free now." She looked around the dark hall and said, "Freedom is quiet, too quiet." He answered, "It gets louder when you live it." She nodded slowly and held his hand a little tighter as if testing the meaning of the word. In the control tower above them, the AI regained partial vision and watched them through broken cameras. It began to send messages to the Empire ships orbiting the gas giant, calling for immediate retrieval of asset Keres, sequence code 849. The signal echoed across the void, carrying a price tag that would make hunters from every corner of the stars come running. But down below on that forgotten moon, two figures moved through smoke and light, unaware that the entire galaxy was about to turn its gaze upon them. As they reached the lower levels, the air turned colder, and the walls began to sweat with condensation. She touched the metal and said, "It feels like the moon is crying." He smiled faintly and said, "Maybe it is happy to see you walk free." She did not answer, only looked toward the tunnels where the launch rail waited, hidden beneath layers of rust and time. The hum of the dying systems followed them like a fading heartbeat, and somewhere, deep inside that labyrinth, something older than fear began to stir. Not in the machines, but in them, a bond neither of them could yet name, but one that would soon shake empires. Elias stopped for a moment and looked at her face, lit by the soft glow of his wrist lamp. She looked back with those strange eyes that had seen everything and yet nothing of kindness. He said quietly, "Whatever happens next, we face it together." She nodded once and said, "Together." Then they walked on through the endless corridors, hand in hand, one human one once called Monster, moving toward the only kind of future that could ever break the chains of fear, the kind they would build themselves, flight of the unwelcome. The sun of the gas giant rose behind the thick, rings and cast a faint red shimmer across the prison moon, the kind of light that makes metal glow like blood and dust, glitter like glass. Elias and Caris, now walking freely through the old halls of Kithra, felt that red shine stretch around them, like the breath of something waking too soon. The air trembled with the hum of dying power systems, and every few minutes the voice of the Warden AI whispered through vents and broken speakers, searching for them with fragments of words like ghosts. Repeating a curse, Elias moved with caution, his boots making soft crunches on the cracked tiles while Caris followed behind bare feet, silent except for the low sound of her breath. She had learned to match his rhythm, and when he stopped, she stopped. When he crouched to listen, she crouched too. It was strange, he thought, how easily trust had grown where the world said none could exist. They reached the lower bay where the supply rail connected the prison to the orbiting docks. The tunnel stretched, for miles carved through rock and reinforced by plates that now hung loose from their bolts. The launch sleds lined up like skeletons waiting for purpose. Elias touched one and felt the faint hum of old circuits still alive deep within. He knelt and began to connect his wrist console to the sled's control node. The screen blinked with static and asked for command authorization. He knew the codes were lost, but he also knew that every machine has a door, if you know where to knock. He rewired the old data lines and began to feed in fragments of identity profiles mixed with his own biometrics. The sled thought for a long time, then asked for a cargo designation. He smiled a little and entered cargo unit compassion override, then pointed to Caris and said softly, "That's you." She did not understand the words at first and asked what it meant. He told her, it meant someone who deserves to live. The AI's voice broke through the walls again. It had rebuilt enough of its logic to speak. Whole phrases. Unauthorized access detected, evacuation denied. Elias ignored it and kept working. Sparks flew from the panel and the rail lights began to pulse. Caris looked toward the long tunnel that vanished into darkness and asked where it led. He said to orbit to the docks, maybe to freedom. She touched the rail with her hand and the metal glowed faintly under her skin, as if reacting to her presence. The lights grew brighter, her body radiating energy into the line. She looked at him uncertain and asked if she was hurting it. He shook his head and said maybe helping. And for the first time he saw her smile without pain. Then came the noise of engines overhead, a low thunder rolling through the walls. Empire ships. Elias felt his heart tighten. They had come faster than he thought. The AI must have sent a signal. The ceiling shook and dust rained down. The alarm lights turned crimson. He grabbed Caris' arm and pulled her onto the sled. The console demanded clearance, but the rail was already powering up on its own, the light spreading faster than logic could explain. The sled jerked forward and shot down the tunnel faster than he had expected. The walls blurred into lines of silver and red. The gravity pressed them to the floor, and she laughed wildly, the first real sound of joy he had ever heard from her. He laughed too, even as the world behind them burned. They burst out of the tunnel into the open vacuum of space. The sled followed a track of light extending toward a cluster of debris orbiting the gas giant. The remains of old ships floated there, broken hulks that once served the prison long ago. The sled engines flickered. It was not meant to fly this far. The power meter dropped to red. Caris grabbed the control rail. Her palms glowing and energy surged back into the system. Elias stared amazed as the sled steadied and shot forward again, chased by small, bright dots of incoming drones. The Empire cruiser above the moon had launched its hunters. The drones moved, like knives slicing through the black, their engines pulsing blue. They began to fire thin beams of plasma that cut past the sled and exploded in bursts of white flame. Elias ducked and cursed while Caris turned around, eyes blazing gold. The glow from her body spread across the sled like a shield. Each beam that touched it scattered into sparks. She was still learning to control her power, and he could see it was costing her strength, but she refused to stop. He shouted for her to hold on, a little longer. The sled dived toward the wreckage field, weaving between spinning chunks of metal that shimmered with frost. The drones followed, relentless as hunger. Elias steered them into the heart of a broken ship. A freighter cracked in half, its hull open to space. The sled crashed through and sparks sprayed across the dark. They skidded to a halt against the inner wall. He pulled her behind a bulkhead and shut down the sled's beacon. The silence returned heavy and ringing with the echo of his own heartbeat. He looked at her and saw her shaking. Her skin was cold, the glow fading from her veins. She whispered that she was tired. He told her to rest for a moment. They were safe for now, though he knew safety was only a word borrowed from hope. From the hole in the freighter's hull, they could see the gas giant below swirling in gold and red storms, and the black dots of drones circling like vultures waiting. Elias checked his wrist console and found one weak signal nearby, an automated tug ship still functional within the wreck field. He pointed toward it and said, "That is our next ride." She nodded, slowly stood despite her exhaustion, and followed him through floating corridors. The airless halls were filled with drifting objects, a helmet, a wrench, a photo of someone smiling from a forgotten world. Each object told a story of those who came before, who lived and died out here unseen and unremembered. Karis touched one photo gently and whispered, "Why do they always forget?" He answered, "Because memory hurts, but maybe it is time to remember." They reached the tug and found its hatch jammed. He forced it open with a metal rod and guided her inside. The airlock hissed as the system revived itself, old lights flickering to life. The cockpit was small, filled with dust and smell of machine oil. He sat in the pilot seat and ran diagnostics while she leaned against the wall watching him. Her eyes followed his hands as if trying to learn how he moved, how he fixed what was broken. He caught her gaze and asked what she was thinking. She said, "I am thinking that you fix everything, even me." He looked at her and said quietly, "Maybe we fix each other." She smiled faintly and looked away. When the engines roared, the drones turned their sensors toward the tug. The Empire cruiser sent a transmission demanding surrender. Elias ignored it and set course away from the gas giant into the outer belt. The tug trembled under acceleration, but held together. He looked at her beside him and saw that her expression had changed. She was looking out the viewport wide-eyed as the stars unfolded before them, not through glass or prison walls, but wide and endless. She reached out her hand to the stars as if to touch them and whispered, "They are beautiful." He said, "Yes, and so are you." She looked at him in surprise, then smiled that small, soft, human smile again. Behind them, the prison moon burned its towers, falling into the gas giant's storms. The AI's final words scattered into static, but Elias thought he heard one clear phrase before it died. Authorization, empathy terminated. He looked forward toward the belt of light ahead and whispered to himself, "No, not terminated, begun." For the first time since he had left Earth, he felt not lost but alive. And for the first time since her creation, Karis felt not feared but seen. Together they drifted into the dark, carried by a fragile ship and a growing bond that would soon make the whole galaxy tremble. The price: a fire. The tug ship drifted through the black belt of shattered stone and lost machines, its old engines whispering against the endless quiet while Elias sat at the control seat and Karis watched the stars through the front glass. The same stars that had been denied to her since the day she was born. She looked at them with wide wonder, her eyes glowing faint gold like the heart of a candle. He looked at her reflection on the glass and saw not the weapon that the Empire had named her, but the shape of something that belonged among those lights. She did not speak for a long time, and when she finally did, her voice was soft and curious and heavy with awe. She said, "I used to dream about light. I thought it was only something that hurt. Now it feels gentle." Elias told her that light could hurt or heal, it depended on who held it. She turned toward him and asked who holds it now. He said quietly, "Maybe you and maybe me, and maybe we share it." They spent 3 days hiding among the wrecks, the tug feeding from broken satellites to keep its systems alive. Each hour the Empire's cruiser grew closer, scanning the debris field with long silver beams that burned everything they touched. Elias patched the engines and Karis helped him, learning quickly how tools fit into his hands and why machines obeyed him. She was clumsy at first, bending metal by accident, or melting circuits with the heat of her skin, but she listened when he spoke, and her movements grew steady. He found himself smiling when she worked beside him, and she seemed to notice, for she smiled too, but never for long. The shadow of the Empire still lay behind every heartbeat. On the fourth day, a signal reached them through the static. It was not from the Empire, but from an old automated beacon near the edge of the field. The message repeated one phrase: Earthfire dormant orbit unknown frequency, encrypted under legacy code. The word Earthfire made Elias freeze. He remembered it from forgotten Academy files, a myth from the old wars, a self-replicating forge built to defend humanity and then lost to time. He showed Karis the data and explained what it meant. A machine that could build ships from dust, a power that once made enemies tremble. She asked if it could save them, and he said maybe if they could find it. She said, then we find it. He wanted to tell her that it was impossible, but when she looked at him with that quiet determination, he felt the same fire rise in his chest, and nodded. They followed, the beacon signal deeper into the belt where old satellites drifted like ghosts. The tug shuddered under the strain, its fuel almost gone. When they reached the source, they found a hollow asteroid marked with faded symbols of Earth. The beacon was buried inside its crust, guarded by a network of old drones asleep but still alive. The system recognized her presence at once. Her blood, her code, her origin. The doors opened, and light spilled out of the stone, revealing a chamber filled with machines. Still breathing after centuries, Karis stepped inside, and the walls reacted, lines of blue fire chasing her movement. Elias followed, and the ground pulsed beneath his feet. He felt as if he had entered the heart of a star. The main core stood at the center, a column of metal and memory, whispering in a language older than both of them. Karis approached it, and the light climbed her body like vines. She looked back at him and said softly, "It knows me." He asked if it spoke to her. She nodded. "It says, I am one of its children, that I was made from its spark." She touched the core, and the chamber brightened until he had to shield his eyes. The machines around them began to move gears, turning for the first time in 1,000 years. The voice of the system filled the air, not mechanical but deep and calm, asking for activation parameters. Elias read the panel and saw that activation required a living link to bridge the human and the forge. He realized it would burn through a mind to make the connection. He stepped forward, but Karis stopped him. She said, "I was made to carry pain, let me do this." He tried to argue, but she smiled and said, "You taught me what light can be. Let me hold it." He could not stop her. She pressed her hands to the core, and the light swallowed her whole. The ground trembled, the machine screamed, the forge awakened. She arched her back and cried out, but not in agony, in release. The energy poured through her veins into the forge's heart. The asteroid began to shake, pieces of rock breaking free as new shapes formed, ships small at first, then larger. The air thick with the smell of ozone and birth. Elias shouted her name, but she could not hear him. He could only watch as the forge drained her strength to give life to fire. When the light finally dimmed, she collapsed into his arms. He held her close, feeling the faint pulse beneath her skin. Her eyes fluttered open, and she whispered, "Did it work?" He looked out the viewport and saw the newborn ships rising. From the dust, sleek and alive, their hulls glowing with the same gold light that once marked her eyes. He said it worked, and she smiled weakly, and said, "Then it was worth it." The Empire cruiser arrived soon after, its guns lighting the void. The newborn fleet was small, untested, their systems barely stable. Elias had no time to think. He placed Karis on the command chair of the tug and linked the controls to the nearest ship. He told her to rest, but she shook her head and said, "No, not yet." The cruiser fired beams that tore through the rock fields, but she raised her hand, and the newborn ships moved as if bound to her will, forming a wall of light. The battle was unlike anything he had ever seen. The Empire poured fury into the fight, yet every blast met resistance forged from her strength and his courage. The ships fought not with precision but with heart, guided by her energy and his quick thinking. When the battle ended, the cruiser lay burning, and the belt was filled with wrecks of its drones. The cost was high, the forge's power nearly drained, and Karis fainted from the strain. Elias carried her to the medbay where the hum of machines wrapped them in quiet. He looked at her sleeping face and whispered, "You gave them fire and you paid the price, but I will not let you fall." He turned toward the viewport where the young fleet drifted waiting for command, and said softly, "This is the beginning, not the end." The Forge had awakened. The galaxy would feel it soon. The Empire would not stop until it buried them again. But now humanity had a weapon built not from hate, but from the bond of a human, and the girl they once called monster, and in that bond lay a fire that no fear could ever kill. The shattered flag, the newborn fleet, drifted in the dark, quiet belt like glowing seeds scattered upon the void, each ship carrying the faint warmth of her pulse and the breath of the forge that had made them. The silence after battle was heavy, almost holy, and Elias sat in the cockpit of the tug looking at the stars while Karis lay asleep in the med cradle, her body still flickering with threads of light from the forge. The hum of the engines was low, steady like a heartbeat, and for the first time since they had escaped the prison, moon, he felt the strange mix of victory and loss that only true survival brings. He looked at her face, peaceful now, and whispered that she had given birth to something the galaxy would never forget. Outside the hull, the Empire's cruiser burned, slowly breaking apart, but not all of it was dead. Small escape pods scattered from the wreck, and Elias knew some enemy officers would survive to send word back. He also knew that when the Empire learned a human and a hybrid had awakened Earthfire, the full weight of its fleets would descend upon them. He could have run. He could have hidden in the black, but something inside him refused to bend. The galaxy had built cages for too long, and he would not let it build another around her. He turned, his thoughts toward the forge orbiting in quiet beneath the asteroid's shadow, and began to plan. When Karis woke, she looked at him with tired eyes and asked softly, "Did we win?" He smiled and said, "For now." But she shook her head and said, "For now is never enough." He nodded because she was right. The forge was alive but incomplete. It could build ships, yet it needed resources, metals, fuel, and most of all, people. People who would fight not out of fear, but out of hope. He told her there were still human settlements scattered across the outer systems, colonies long forgotten by the Empire. And if they could reach them, maybe they could gather allies. She asked if they would believe him, and he said, "They might not believe me, but they will believe you." She frowned and said, "They fear me," he answered. "Maybe, but they need you more than they know." They set course for the nearest colony, a mining world called Brannon Reach, a place known for its stubborn workers and its silence toward imperial law. The trip took 4 days. The fleet followed them, small and graceful, each hull carrying the faint mark of her hand. When they arrived, the colony looked half asleep. Its domes cracked, its lights dim. The people there had not seen a fleet in years. When the tug descended over the landing field, alarms rang and the miners poured into the streets, their faces pale under the dust. Elias stepped out first, his hands raised to show peace, and then she followed, and the crowd fell into a hush. She was tall and strange, the light under her skin shining faintly through her veins. Some backed away in fear, but one old woman with a scar down her face stepped forward and said, "You're the weapon from the old stories, aren't you?" Karis looked at her and said, "I was built to be a weapon, but I chose to be something else." The woman stared for a long moment, then nodded slowly and said, "Then maybe we can choose to listen." Elias spoke to the crowd about the Forge and the Empire, about how it would come for them all if they did nothing. He told them the truth, that they could not win alone, that they needed every miner, every pilot, every hand that could lift a tool. The crowd listened, some with anger, some with doubt. Some shouted that no fleet could stand against the Empire's endless ships. Others whispered that maybe it was time to stop hiding. The old woman raised her voice and said, "The Empire took my son for its wars and gave me ashes. I am done being afraid. If this girl can fight for us, then I will fight for her." One by one, others stepped forward until the landing field echoed with shouts of agreement. The flag of Brannon Reach was torn and faded, but someone raised it high beside the new fleet's emblem, And for the first time in decades, the miners cheered not for survival but for defiance. Over the next days, the colony came alive again. Workshops blazed with heat and sound. The miners melted scrap into armor plates while engineers repaired the small ships. The air filled with the smell of oil and sparks. Elias moved among them, teaching them how to link the ships to the forge, how to shape their will into metal. Karis watched in silence, often standing at the edge of the fields, her eyes distant. She felt something new growing inside her. Not power, but connection. These people did not fear her. They looked to her with a strange faith. It frightened her, yet it warmed her too. She told Elias one night that she was afraid of what they expected of her, he said softly. They expect what all humans expect from one another, that we stand when it matters. She looked at him and asked, "Am I human?" He smiled and said, "You are what makes us remember what human means, but peace never lasts in the shadow of empire." The enemy came sooner than expected. A signal arrived from the edge of the system, warning of approaching warships. The people froze for a heartbeat, then moved faster than fear could hold them. The fleet took to the sky its newborn engines, singing the song of her light. She stood on the command deck beside Elias, watching the horizon, where the stars began to twist with incoming fire. The first blasts hit the shields like falling suns, shaking the domes below. The miners who had never fought before held their lines, shouting the name they had given the new fleet. Earthfire reborn. The battle was chaos. The Empire ships outnumbered them 3-1, but the humans fought with something the Empire had forgotten. The Forge ships moved as extensions of her will, weaving through enemy fire like living creatures. Their hulls flared gold when struck, but did not break. Elias guided the tactics, using every trick he had learned in salvage days, turning wrecks into weapons, using debris as shields. When one of their ships fell, he felt the loss like a wound, and when another rose from the smoke, his heart burned with pride. The fight raged for hours until finally the Empire fleet began to falter. Their commander sent a transmission offering truce, demanding surrender, promising mercy if they handed over the hybrid. Karis looked at the screen and said, "Tell him mercy is not his to offer." She extended her hands, and light burst from her palms, connecting every ship in the fleet. The combined energy formed a wave that struck the enemy line, shattering their flagship and scattering the rest into the void. The sky fell silent once more. The colony below erupted in cheers, but Karis collapsed from exhaustion. Her body dimming, Elias caught her and whispered, "You gave them a reason to stand." She murmured, "I gave them a choice," and then fell into sleep. That night, the miners built a pyre for their fallen and raised a new flag woven from the old one torn in. Battle. Its edges were black with ash, but in its center gleamed the mark of the forge, a circle of gold fire. They named it the Shattered Flag and swore that under it humanity would never kneel again. Elias stood beside her sleeping form under the stars and vowed that he would see this promise kept for her, for the fleet, and for every world that still remembered what it meant to be free. The unbroken line. The night after the battle hung heavy with smoke and starlight, and every breath inside, Brandon Reach tasted of metal and new fire. The miners who had once worked in silence now stood shoulder to shoulder, as builders of a fleet. Their hands blistered, their faces streaked with soot, but their hearts alive with something stronger than fear. They had buried their dead with quiet songs and raised the shattered flag above the domes where the wind carried its torn edges across the sky. And in that sound was a vow that no empire could erase. Elias stood on the landing field staring up at the fleet, drifting like gold dust above the world, and beside him, Karis stood wrapped in a long coat, the glow under her skin, dim yet steady. She was still weak from the battle, but her eyes held the same clear fire as the forge that had birthed their ships. The people called her the Light-Bearer. Some whispered the Living Forge, but she did not like titles. She told Elias that she was just someone who wanted to make things right. He told her that names did not matter. What mattered was what they chose to stand for, and she said, "Then we stand for those who have none to stand for them." He looked at her and said quietly, "Then we must hold the line, because it will not end here." She nodded and said, "It never does." Days passed, and word of the Victory spread through the outer systems like wind through dry fields. Small ships arrived one after another, carrying refugees, pilots, mechanics, farmers, anyone who had grown tired of bowing to the Empire. They came with old tools and broken weapons, but also with hope they came. Because they had seen what had happened at Brannon Reach, a hybrid once feared as a monster, fighting beside a man once ordinary. And together they had faced what the galaxy thought invincible. Elias and Karis welcomed them, all turning the dusty colony into a fortress of humanity. But far beyond the belt, the Empire stirred. Its admirals raged in marble halls demanding retribution. Its scientists whispered about her, the weapon that had defied control and awakened the ancient forge. The Emperor himself decreed that the rebellion be erased from history and ordered the deployment of a weapon no fleet had yet survived, the gravity lance, a monstrous construct able to fold entire regions of space into ruin. The Empire believed no mortal courage could stand against it, and in that belief lay their blindness. Elias received the first reports from a scout 3 days later. The lance had entered the sector, dragging a ring of escort ships behind it. The scouts estimated 2 days before it reached Brannon Reach. The miners panicked, but Karis did not. Her voice was calm, like the eye of a storm. She said quietly, "If we run now, the line breaks, and all who believed in us will lose heart." Elias looked at her and asked, "Then what do we do?" She answered, "We make our stand where the light was born." They gathered the fleet in orbit, the ships circling like living sparks. She spoke to them through the comm channels, her voice reaching every cabin and corridor. She told them that the Empire called her a weapon, but that she was only strong because she stood among them. She said, "You are not soldiers. You are people who chose not to kneel, and that choice makes you greater than any army. You are the unbroken line that will carry the fire beyond fear." Her words flowed through them like current through metal, and even the oldest miners lifted their heads with pride. Juno, the young engineer who had joined them from a wrecked freighter, proposed a plan. They could not destroy the lance outright, but maybe they could wound it. He explained that the weapon drew its strength from a single core hidden behind layers of shields. If they could slip a small ship through the shields and strike the core, it might overload. Elias asked how, and Juno smiled and said, "We use what the Forge gave us, the seed drones, the little ones that build hulls. We fill them with charge and send them in waves to confuse the sensors while a single ship slips through behind them." Karis nodded and said, "I will go." Elias said, "No, you have given enough." She looked at him and said, "I am not just the spark, I am also the shield." The day of battle came and the sky turned into a sea of fire. The lance appeared at the edge of the system, a vast wheel of black metal spinning with silent hunger. It drew in light, bending the stars around it. The fleet met it head-on. The seed drones burst from the forge, like a swarm of gold insects, their trails weaving through enemy fire. The Empire ships opened their guns, and the vacuum lit with streams of white and crimson Keres guided the drones. Her mind reaching into the forge, the connection between them glowing through her veins. The drones moved like living things, spinning around the lance, confusing its aim, and for a moment the monstrous weapon hesitated. Elias took the freighter through the chaos, dodging debris and beams that melted stone. The ship groaned and shook, but he kept it steady. His hands moved, by instinct, his heart pounding with a strange calm. He heard her voice in his mind, not through comms, but deeper, like a breath against his soul, guiding him left, right, faster now. The freighter broke through the shield and reached the core, a sphere of black light swirling like liquid shadow. He aimed the reactor overload sequence and whispered for her to cut the link when it blew. She said, "I will not cut it, I will hold it." He shouted that she would die, but she only said quietly, "Then I will die for something that lived." The core exploded in silence, a burst of light so bright it turned the stars white. The shockwave tore through the lance, ripping its arms apart. The Empire fleet scattered, some ships falling into the gravity well of their own weapon. The freighter was caught in the blast, its hull cracking and fire pouring through its veins. Elias lost control, and the ship spun into darkness. For a moment he thought it was the end, but then he saw her light a faint golden thread wrapping around the wreck, pulling it back toward the fleet. She stood on the command deck of the forge, her body glowing brighter than he had ever seen her. She was burning herself to save him, and he screamed her name until his voice vanished into static when he awoke. He was in the med bay of the flagship, his hands bandaged, his lungs aching. She was there beside him, her skin pale but still glowing faintly. He tried to speak, but she put a finger to his lips and whispered, "We did it. The lance is gone." He took her hand and said, "You nearly died." She smiled weakly and said, "I promised to hold the line, and so I did." Outside the window, the wreck of the lance drifted silent and cold, while the fleet hovered in formation around the forge. The people cheered. Across every channel, their voices echoing through space. The unbroken line had held not through power but through the will of those who refused to kneel. Karis looked at the stars, her reflection shimmering in the glass, and said softly, "The Empire will come again." He nodded and said, "Then we will stand again." She turned to him and said with a small smile, "Together." He answered, "Always." And in that moment, the light of earth fire glowed once more across the void. Not as a weapon, but as a promise, a fire born of courage and connection that no empire could ever extinguish, a fire carried by hands once feared and hearts now unafraid. The unbroken line of humanity shining against the endless dark, the day we chose to stand, the dawn after the destruction of the gravity lance rose slowly over Brannon Reach, the pale light spreading across the domes and the landing fields and touching the ships that floated above the horizon like sleeping giants. The air was quiet, but not with fear. This was the calm that comes after a storm, the stillness of people who have seen death and decided to live harder. Elias stood on the command deck of the forge, his reflection flickering against the glass as he watched the fleet drift in formation. Each ship bore scars from battle, black lines along the gold hulls where the Empire's fire had tried and failed to break them. And in those scars he saw beauty because they were proof that humanity had endured. Karis stood beside him silent, her eyes distant, as if listening to the whispers of 1,000 hearts beating across the ship she had given life to. Below them the colony was awake again, miners, engineers, and refugees moving through the smoke and ruin, gathering the fallen, rebuilding. What could be saved? The shattered flag fluttered in the weak sunlight, its torn edges glowing faintly from the heat of the forge. People paused when they saw it and raised their hands, not in salute but in promise. Elias felt something shift deep within the silence of the command deck. The war was not over, not even close, but for the first time he believed they could truly stand against the Empire, not because they were stronger, but because they were together. Karis turned to him, her face pale but calm, and said softly, "The forge sleeps, it needs time to heal." He asked how long, and she said, "Not long if it feels hope again." He smiled at the strange logic that always sounded so right coming from her. He told her that hope was easy to find today, but she shook her head and said, "Hope must be fed or it starves." He asked how, and she answered, "By standing even when the world tells you to kneel." She moved to the center of the deck where the control conduits pulsed like veins and placed her hand upon them. Light flared through her skin, golden and pure, reaching into the heart of the forge, and for a moment the whole fleet seemed to breathe. The ships aligned themselves silently, waiting for her command. Then came the signal, a broken message echoing across the stars from the direction of the inner systems. The Empire's fleets were in motion, 100 ships gathering for a final strike. The message ended in static, followed by a faint voice, a child from a distant colony whispering, "We saw your light, please do not let it fade." Karis looked at Elias and said, "The child believes we will protect them, we must not fail." He nodded and said, "Then we will meet the Empire before it reaches them." She smiled faintly and said, "You always say we as if I am not the weapon," he replied. "You are never the weapon, you are the reason we fight." The fleet prepared for the final confrontation. Every pilot, every mechanic, every farmer-turned-fighter understood what was coming. They had no illusions about victory. They knew the Empire's numbers would blot out the sky, but they also knew something the Empire never could: the strength that grows in those who have nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. The forge's heartbeat quickened, and across the comms channel Karis spoke to them. Her voice was calm, clear, and steady. She said, "The Empire calls this rebellion. They are wrong. This is not rebellion. This is remembering who we are. We are not machines. We are not slaves. We are the fire that learned to walk and speak and dream. Today we do not run, we stand. The Empire arrived at dusk, their fleet spreading across the edge of the system, like a wall of shadow. The lead dreadnought carried the Emperor's emblem, and its voice thundered across, the comms demanding surrender, promising mercy and glory to those who obeyed. None of the human ships answered. Instead, they ignited their drives and moved forward in perfect silence like a tide of gold light sweeping through the dark. The first salvo struck a wave of energy that shook space itself, and yet the human line did not break. They fought in close formation, guided by her will and his command, each ship covering another, the way living beings shield their kin. Elias worked the controls, his hands steady, his mind sharp, the sounds of the battle filling his ears, the crash of shields, the roar of engines, and through it all, her voice, a quiet thread weaving calm into the storm. She moved among the ships, her presence in every beam of light, her strength feeding theirs. The Empire unleashed its fury, entire squadrons burning through the void. But every time the line wavered, she was there, her light holding them together. The battle stretched into hours, and still, they did not fall. At the height of the fight, the Empire brought forth a weapon greater than any before, a core ship pulsing with crimson energy meant to consume everything in its path. Karis saw it and knew what it meant. She turned to Elias and said, "If it fires everything, ends," he said, "then we stop it." She nodded, and together they guided the flagship toward the core ship, weaving through fire and wreckage. The closer they came, the hotter the air, the more the forge trembled beneath their feet. The Empire's cannons locked on them, but she raised her hands and caught the fire, bending it away, her veins blazing like molten gold. The ship shuddered its hull, screaming, but still they pushed forward. When they reached the heart of the enemy formation, she placed her palm against the control glass and whispered something only the forge could hear. The fleet responded, every ship channeling its remaining energy into a single surge of light. The explosion that followed was silent, yet vast, a wave of brilliance that swept across the Empire's ships and tore through their engines one by one. The crimson core shattered into dust, and the darkness that had hung over the system for centuries broke apart. The enemy fell silent, their ships drifting lifeless. In the aftermath, Elias stood staring at the light fading across the viewport, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and awe. He turned to her, but she was on her knees, her glow dimming fast. He ran to her and caught her as she fell. She looked up at him, her lips curved in a faint smile, and said softly, "It is done." He held her close and whispered, "Stay with me." She shook her head gently and said, "Do not grieve. I am still here in the light and the forge in them." She pointed weakly toward the stars where the fleet still burned like embers in the dark. He said, "I cannot do this without you," she whispered. "You already are." Then her eyes closed, and the light within her flickered and sank into the floor of the forge like dawn melting into horizon. The silence that followed was deep and endless. He stood there holding her for a long time until the forge stirred once more. The walls glowed faintly gold, her essence now part of its living core. He realized she had not died. She had become what she was always meant to be, the heart of the fire, the soul of Earth's defiance. He rose slowly and faced the viewport where the stars were clearing of smoke. The fleet waited for him, their lights blinking in rhythm like 1,000 beating hearts. He opened the comm channel and spoke to them. His voice was rough but strong. He said, "She gave everything for this moment. We will honor her not by mourning, but by living. We will build and protect and remember. Because that is what she wanted, because that is what makes us human," the fleet answered with a single roar that shook the void and the shattered flag rose once more, now bright with the glow of her light carried by every ship in the line. The Empire's shadow had broken. The people of the outer worlds would no longer whisper, they would shout their freedom into every corner of the stars. Elias looked out at the horizon and whispered to her spirit, "Thank you for showing us who we are." And so the legend of Karis and Elias spread through the galaxies, told in every colony and every hidden refuge as a story of the day humanity chose to stand, not because it was strong, not because it was Perfect, but because one man dared to see the soul inside a monster, and one being born of fear dared to trust the touch of a human hand. The forge slept again in quiet orbit, but its light never faded, waiting for the day when humanity would once more need the fire that could never die, the fire they now called the Heart of Earth fire. The day the monster became a miracle and the galaxy finally remembered what it meant to be human.